Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Joy Yamaguchi. I'm the Public Programs Coordinator at the Japanese American National Museum, and I want to thank you for joining us today virtually from wherever you're joining us for this wonderful and exciting program around When Can We Go Back to America by Susan H. Kamei. And we are so lucky, and we have a really exciting conversation coming up for you all. You can purchase this wonderful book, and we have some signed copies available in the JANM bookstore. So please go to the link in the chat, and we would love to have you get a copy for yourself, get a copy for your friends and family. It's a really wonderful book for all ages. And finally, want to encourage you to join us for other online programs that we have as part of our JANM from Home initiative. We know this one is virtual. We are also opening up in person, then we welcome you to join us in person. And all of that can be found on our website, janm.org. And so with that, I want to welcome you again. Thank you for coming today to this program for When Can We Go Back to America? We are really excited. And to introduce this program further, I'm going to pass it over to the president and CEO of JANM, Ann Burrows. So welcome, Ann.
Welcome to all of you, to our guests, our members, and also those of you who are in Los Angeles and those of you who are coming to Los Angeles. I really encourage you to come and visit us. We have two really quite exceptional new exhibitions in our gallery, A Life in Pieces and Mina Okubo's masterpiece. The Life in Pieces is the diary and letters of Stanley Hayami, who as a young man was forcibly removed with his family from the Los Angeles area and incarcerated at Hart Mountain. And it goes on to tell his story through his letters and diary about his service in the 442nd in Europe, where he very, very sadly lost his life. And the Mina Okubo's masterpiece is an extraordinary collection that's actually being exhibited for the first time of the artworks and materials that comprise her masterwork, Citizen 13660. So I hope that you'll visit us, and I hope that you will come and look at those exhibitions. If you don't have the chance, please take a look at our website. You'll certainly find information about them there. So, we're so delighted to be bringing this program to you today, and we're delighted to be collaborating with the Japanese American Citizens League, as well as the Samuel DuBois Cook Center on Social Equity at Duke University. It's the first time, I believe, that the three of us have partnered, and we're really excited to be doing that. As far as JANM is concerned, the program today is brought to you by JANM's National Center for the Preservation of Democracy. And the center's programming examines the rights, the freedoms, and enduring fragility of America's democracy. We all know, of course, that democracy is shaped by people and experiences, and that dialogue and participation are essential to transforming attitudes, to influencing culture, and to promoting an inclusive democracy. And these conversations, like the conversation that we'll have today, have never been more urgent or timely or as relevant now when our historic and social frameworks are being examined, challenged, and debated on a daily basis. So it's an honor. It's an honor for us to be partnering with the two organizations, but it's also for all of us. It's all three organizations. It's an honor to be hosting the LA launch of Susan's book, When Can We Go Back to America? It's an exceptionally powerful book that weaves together the stories of the lived experience of 130 camp survivors. Now more than ever, those stories, their words will resonate so powerfully with readers who are confronting questions about racial identity, immigration, and experience of citizenship, and really grappling with that question about what it means to be an American. And to lead us in the conversation and to introduce Susan and our guests more formally, and of course the program, is Matthew Weisblee, who is the Education and Communications Coordinator of the JSCL National in Los Angeles. He's a graduate of the University of Southern California, and he holds a degree in Japanese and Japanese American history. He's been a very long time J.A. Segal member. He served as the youth representative for the Arizona chapter, as well as he was the inaugural Ted T. Number Fellow of the Pacific Southwest District. And he was also the former Daniel K. Inouye Fellow for JSCL National in Washington. And it was in fact during his time at Washington that I first met Matthew, and we worked together on several projects. So outside of his work with JSCL, he's a member of Nikkei Rising, and he's also a co-host of the Yonsei podcast. And now, Matt, I'm going to hand it over to you. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Anne. And thank you so much to the JANM team for inviting me to be here today. Like Anne said, my name is Matthew Weisblee. I am the current Education Communications Coordinator for the Japanese American Citizens League in Los Angeles. And I'm so excited to be here for this discussion today. And let me go ahead and sort of reintroduce our speakers here really quick. So as Anne introduced, we have William A. Darity Jr., who goes by Sandy. Again, he is the Samuel DuBois Cook Professor of Public Policy, African American Studies, and Economics, and Director for the Samuel DuBois Cook Center on Social Equity at Duke University. And he is joined by A. Kirsten Mullen, writer, folklorist, museum consultant, and lecturer whose work focuses on race, art, history, and politics. And together they wrote the book From Here to Equality, Reparations for Black Americans in the 21st Century. And they'll be joining the discussion with Susan H. Kamei, a former member of the JACL legal team during the redress era, and is the current director of the USC Spatial Sciences Institute, and a professor who teaches a somewhat new course titled War, Race, and the Constitution, looking at the constitutional, political, and historical issues of the Japanese American incarceration and its implications today. And of course, she's the author and scholar of When Can We Go Back to America? Voices of Japanese American Incarceration During World War II. And with that, I'd love to get our discussion started for today. But before we get to our first question, I'll sort of preface it with a story of my own. So for those of you who were joining the chat before this and might have noticed from the bios and intros, Susan and I have a connection to USC. And I actually know Susan not as Susan, but as Professor Kamei. I was actually one of the first students to take her class when it was offered back in 2018. As Anne mentioned, I graduated USC with a degree in Japanese American history. And so this class was something that fit right up my alley and fit a lot with the research I was doing. And it was wonderful to take the class and really delve deeper into the story of the incarceration and its implications today, because even though I'd been researching and studying the incarceration since I was about 10 years old, there was still so much I had to learn. And that class really helped me learn it and actually set me on the path I'm on today. It actually helped me lead to writing an honors thesis my senior year on the 442nd 100th Infantry Battalion and MIS, which Professor Kamei was so gracious to be one of my consulting professors on, and eventually actually helped me lead back to this job I'm currently doing with the JACL. And so once Professor Kamei asked me to read the book and be part of this program here today, I couldn't say no. And it was so great to read the book and see it and sort of remind myself of the class and how I got to where I'm at now, and see just how much of that class and all that history fit into this book that on the outside looks 700 pages, but really fits in about 300 pages if you're not looking at the bibliography and the bios as well. But I think it's such a great resource for people who have never learned anything about the incarceration or know a little bit about the incarceration, and really emphasize that whole 15-week course into just this small little package that can fit in your backpack. And so with that, those are sort of my first implications or reactions to the book. And so I wanted to ask first, Kirsten and Sandy, what were your first impressions of the book when you first heard about it and then actually getting to read it? Oh, sorry, you're on mute.
You want to start?
I was so thrilled. I was so thrilled to see the book. And, you know, from the amazing photograph on the cover that just kind of took you in immediately, you know, it was like really clear that this is going to be a really, it's a dense story with a lot of moving parts. I so appreciated just the panoply of stories. You know, so often we're forced to see, you know, one story or a composite. But I was just delighted to see all of these names and you could follow, individuals at different points of their lives, which I thought was really, really important. But I was also struck by, just the specificity of the stories, breaking the experience down, sort of day by day recollections. There's a telling and then there's the feeling. I was thinking about Jean Toyo Wakatsuki Houston's telling of how, she was describing her reaction to her nephew's questions. He was born in Manzanar, but he didn't know very much about it because his parents didn't talk about it. And then he asked her all these years later, how did you feel about that? And she thought, oh my gosh, I never even allowed myself to consider that. But just thinking about all that repressed pain and sorrow and loss that so many people experienced, and were just didn't feel able to even express it among themselves. Just the revelations were just extraordinary.
I think it's an extraordinary work, Susan, and I was powerfully moved by the stories. I thought it was especially useful to have these interspersed testimonials where in some sense we could follow the same individual throughout the text, making different comments and observations about what had occurred. I think that there's some way in which you might connect this to the slave narratives, in the sense that this is revelatory from the perspective of the individuals who were subjected to the atrocity, about what actually happened to them. I was particularly thinking at one stage as I was reading through the book, what in the world were the health and sanitation conditions that confronted these folks who had been incarcerated? And there's a point of the text where you talk about that at length, and it's horrifying, right? And so at one point I asked Kirsten, is there evidence that the longevity of the folks who had been subjected to incarceration had been shortened as a consequence of this experience? And I believe that the answer is yes. So this is another American atrocity. It's a deep atrocity, and this is the most powerful account I've ever seen of what people endured during the process of this incarceration. I'd like to add something that's more personal about my research center. I think, we're very, very proud to have the opportunity to collaborate with the museum and with JACL. Our research center at Duke is devoted to the analysis of inequality, and in particular, inequality between social groups. And so we're very, very concerned about conditions where groups are subjected to marginalization and oppression. And being able to explore this particular case with the community that had to undergo it is a very valuable and powerful experience for us.
Thank you so much, Kirsten and Sandy, Matthew. And I'd just like to say at the outset how thrilled I am, what an honor it is to get to have both JCL, the museum, and the DuBois Center to be part of the launch activity for my book. I grew up in the JCL community. My dad was a 3-time Untitled Chapter president and involved with just about every other Japanese American organization in Orange County and in Southern California. Was family. My dad was part of the museum from its opening, and so our family roots are very deep in both organizations. This is my jet in purple today. And Sandy and Kirsten and I have been a part of a handful of programs now. And so it's been just a wonderful opportunity to be part of this ongoing conversation between the Black reparations question and what's happened within the Japanese American community. And it's very meaningful to me that what Matthew's doing and the connection that we have. In fact, in the member meeting, he's so respectful. I think that's the first time I actually ever heard him call me Susan and not Professor Kamei. So it's just great to have such wonderful colleagues and the support of all these organizations. It was an incredible opportunity to be able to do a book for the general public from a major publisher such as Simon & Schuster, and I just want to acknowledge the tremendous support from the Simon & Schuster team, both from the young adult imprint, the books for young readers, the education and library section, and the divisions that support the general nonfiction readership, because the book is intended to be a crossover, and so accessible for students and teachers of history and other topics. So much of the material includes an online teacher's guide, a glossary, a large timeline that will help contextualize what was happening to the Japanese American community with the larger history of World War II and trying to bring that forward. I'm delighted to hear that the bios are useful. That was a project unto itself. And in some cases, we're able to tap into oral histories or connect with descendants and family members to provide additional information or what information we have now in the book. So it was just a great opportunity to put into one place for individuals who would not know anything about the camp experience, but also for those that had some connection, that maybe there's some elements that are new and are part of enlarging the understanding of the scope of such a large and traumatic episode.
Yeah, and I think my next question, we've sort of discussed this before, but I think a lot of the book and where it came from has to do with the class we took back at USC. And so I sort of wanted to ask, what was the impetus for starting the book, starting the research? Was it solely to do with that class and what came of it, or was there more to it?
Yeah, it was in the process of creating the proposal for being able to offer the class. And then in the first iteration of teaching it was when I did really the most of the research that found its way into the book. And so it wasn't the book and then the course, it was really the course and then the book. And some folks, some colleagues at USC had actually said to me, you pulled together such amazing material and there isn't anything like this out there, and you really should write a book. And actually it came together that way. In the editorial process, though, there were places because the editors were not, from the community, did not know anything about the camp experience, and so it was a very healthy check to have readers looking at this from an editorial perspective to say, okay, you're carrying around a lot of assumed knowledge about a topic such as picture brides or cultural cultural things like, what does it mean to express gaman, or what does shigataganai mean? And so they would ask questions about, well, explain this more, or making it relatable so that you didn't have to know a lot of for instance, the legal sections about the cases and whatever, that you did not have to have civil procedure in law school in order to understand some really complicated history of how those cases progressed up and down, courts of appeal into the Supreme Court, and then what happened in the Kormnobu's cases that reopened the criminal convictions later. And so it was, trying to break down things to a general readership level. So there were many things that as I was filling in holes or looking into areas that didn't fit within my family backdrop, such as the Japanese Latin America issue, were opportunities for me to do more research and to include that. And then it's found its way into the course, in the iteration of the course since the time that Matthew took it.
I will say it was an amazing and wonderful course, like I've already mentioned. And if people would like to, there's actually a write-up in the LA Times from back in 2018 on the course when it was first offered, which I would suggest people go and take a look at if you're able to. But one of the things I found really interesting about the book is that it goes just beyond the incarceration experience. A lot of what we have is the war ended, people went home and that was it, or it focuses simply on the redress era. But the book really goes from immigration to Pearl Harbor to incarceration to redress and beyond. And so I think one of the important things is that beyond part. So I wanted to ask all of you, what do you think the implications of the book, the story of the incarceration, the redress era, what does all of that have to, what are the implications of all of those stories and that history for today?
I'll start. I mean, it's a big question. I wanted to say just before I do that one of the really wonderful parts for me when I think about sharing this book with young adults young adult readers is how just by giving the ages of the individuals at the point that they were incarcerated, you thought, oh, I could see young people saying, wow, that person's my age or younger than I am. And then seeing, going to the back, to the bio to see, how, it's not a cause and effect, but getting some sense of how that experience led them to do whatever they did with their lives. And in some cases, it's like, you've got your heroes, you've got your superheroes. I mean, it was just really fantastic to have all that information together. But I wanted to say too, so thinking about, we've been working on this question of, a redress movement for Black American descendants of U.S. slavery. And I was so struck by, many, many parallels that are revealed in Susan's book. The one-drop rule, for example, that was applied to, anyone who had, any evidence of Japanese blood, could be incarcerated.
As if there's
As if
something
you can measure that.
Japanese blood.
Right, what does that mean exactly? But that was, I thought, oh goodness, we know where they got that from. Comparing the incarceration moment to a picnic, one of the newspapers, and I thought, oh, this is like, the lynchings, which they said were like, come down for a picnic on the square, entertainment. But thinking about, the necessity for public engagement and struggling to figure out how to do it so the maximum number of people could participate. I was really struck by the efforts in 1981 in Los Angeles to have translators come to a meeting that was held in Little Tokyo at a senior, a residence complex for seniors. I mean, this is something that the California Department of Justice Reparations Task Force is struggling with right now. How can we make it possible for more people to comment, more people to be aware of the work that we're doing? In so many ways, the book for me was like a thriller. You've got the villains, and I was glad to know their names. Get my dartboard, for these villains. But glad to know who were, the people who were working, constantly within their families, within the buildings in which they were incarcerated, trying to get messages out to other people, staying connected, writing to the men who were enlisted in the military. I was just really happy to know, all of that activity that was taking place in the background. It was interesting to learn that the military pay for the men, the differential was very similar to the differential of Blacks and whites in the Union Army. So another case where they said, oh, we know how to discriminate in this way, to discriminate in wages. or that the Jerome Center in Arkansas had one doctor for every 1,142 individuals. I mean, there's so many cases where, you know, the number of hospital beds for the colored was so limited or non-existent in some cases.
Yeah, we actually use that in our book as a measure of the discount rate on Black lives, the differential in available hospital beds during the period of legal segregation. Yeah.
But having to deal with, you know, the Arkansas governor who was a former KKK member,
Yeah.
for example, or just the hostility of the Wyoming and Idaho governors who absolutely did not want these centers to be in their states. But just the war of words. You know, I was intrigued, you know, the lie of exclusion and assembly centers versus the reality of incarceration, convicts, prisoners, you know, but always, you know, who controls the battle of language? And I've seen more recently, and I'm not sure, Susan, if you had some role in this, but a fabulous document on language to be used when talking about the Japanese American redress movement. But that kind of thing that kind of specificity is really important and helps, I think, bring the reader in. But also just all of the discussion about tactics, you know, that different people came up with. You know, at one point, I think it was Grace, is it Uyehara? Is that correct?
Grace Uehara.
The letter writing campaign, you know, in support of HR 442. But just, you know, these are things that, you know, the current day movement of Black reparations is struggling with, trying to find their footing, you know, trying to figure out, you know, what's going to bring large numbers of Black people who are not a monolith, you know, with a very different understanding of what reparations is, if it's something that should happen and how it should happen. But I was just very, very interested in just all of the ways that, you know, you resisted presenting a single thread, and, you know, just steadfastly, you know, promoted this notion that, you know, there were a lot of different, you know, ways to look at this, and people had very different understandings of what their roles were and what should happen.
I was particularly struck by the impact on families and the ways in which family dynamics were altered as a consequence of the incarceration. And for some reason, I was really attracted to the testimonials from Louise Ogawa, which I continued to follow throughout the text, especially in terms of her efforts to make sure that there were books available within the camp, and her connection to a librarian who was helping to provide those books. And I think she was only 16 years of age or so at the time where she was incarcerated. It was like the personal stories are really quite touching in terms of really having a sense of what people had to go through during this process. I would say that there are two major implications for the current moment that I can think of immediately. The first is the importance of correcting the historical narrative. And this is, of course, extremely important from the standpoint of the experience of the Black American community, where the historical record in the United States has been distorted and poisoned and continues to be distorted and poisoned in this perverse attack on so-called critical race theory. And so, you know, with the two organizations that have really dominated and cultivated the treatment of slavery, the Civil War, the Reconstruction era, the Civil Rights era, have been the Daughters of the American Revolution and the United Daughters of the Confederacy.
Make an appearance in your book.
Right. And
not in a good way.
And then, of course, there's the native sons of the Great West. Yeah, in what sense were they natives? I mean, you know, this is just this complete manufacturing of the historical narrative that is really the accurate one for the United States. And I think that this book does a phenomenal job of saying, no, this is really what happened. And I think that that's so important. The second thing is, you know, Matthew, you mentioned the period after restitution, even after the atrocity, after restitution or the act of restitution. And, you know, in the aftermath of the Civil War, there was a promise made to the formerly enslaved of 40-acre land grants, and that was a promise that was not met. But in addition to the failure to meet that promise, there were ongoing atrocities, including legal segregation, upwards of 100 massacres that white terrorists conducted throughout the United States between the end of the Civil War and the beginning of World War II, and then ongoing phenomenon of mass incarceration, police executions of unarmed blacks, immense economic disparities between Black and white Americans, and so on. And so I think that one of the parallel issues is the question of ongoing anti-Japanese American racism in the aftermath of the atrocity and in the aftermath of the restitution. And of course, in our community, we've never received the restitution at all.
So I'd like to give a shout out to the museum with regard to the Louise Ogawa and others who were among the Miss Breed letter writers. And so it's Clara Breed was the San Diego librarian, and it's that are in the museum collections. And so those letters are I accessed through the museum archives, and they're very much among the windows of what a teenager was thinking and experiencing. I want to pull on a couple of threads of the things that Kirsten and Sandy had mentioned. And I think one of the things that our books have in common is this notion of saying their names,
Yes.
because making it real that what I've been saying in other interviews is if there were approximately 120,000 individuals who endured the incarceration, there are approximately 120,000 different stories. And so in the soundbite to try to explain what happened, it is important to push against the notion that there was any one monolithic experience, and that there was unique and individual impact. I did on the launch day, there was a interview that NPR New York affiliate, The Takeaway, did that I was privileged to do with Secretary Mineta for a portion of it. And among the very first comments I got on my Facebook afterwards was, heard the blip on NPR, everyone's rights were protected during the war. Okay. And so I recognize that with the book and the activity, the conversation, that there would be the deniers. That it's no matter what we write and no matter what we say and no matter what we put out there. I mean, that was literally among the very first comments, on my Facebook. So I anticipated that would happen, but I think my goal here. I'm glad to hear you felt that if people become real and their experiences become real, then that's an important first step in being able to answer the question, why should I care? It's not just up to somebody else to care about, but why should I care?
Yeah, and I think such a fascinating part of the book is that structure and is bringing in those stories. I have another question, but before we get to that one, I do want to ask sort of how did you come up with the structure of this book and including all of those snippets from the people who lived it? I think it is a very interesting and unique structure for telling this story.
I think it was the function of realizing that there was a treasure trove of the videos that had been done 30, 40 years ago of Nisei at an earlier time in their lives, done by Gensho, done by the museum, the Nisei, various Nisei veterans organizations, because unfortunately, to the extent that the Nisei are still with us. They're in their 90s, and so their ability, it would not have been possible to have started from scratch at this point. But we do have video testimonies, oral histories, interviews of articles, the testimonies that were submitted, both written statements and the transcriptions of the oral testimonies that were given during the congressional, the commission hearings that were held throughout the United States, and various other congressional hearings for both the iterations of the various bills that ultimately became the Civil Liberties Act of 1988 and other bills. For instance, making Bainbridge Island in a Department of the Interior site. And so the material was out there. The congressional record, for instance, Senator Danny Inouye's statement that I had read references to, how moving it was that he paid tribute to his 442nd buddies, many of whom did not come home, and how it was his moment in time to share very personal feelings that he had reserved up to that point. So, the material was out there, but you had to really dig. I mean, I've done a lot of legal research in my time, and it took me a bit to dig through the congressional record and actually find the pages that captured his statement on the Senate floor. And so it was bringing all those, it was the idea of bringing those various resources out there and making it accessible, because otherwise how would anybody have the ability to take advantage of it, to tap into it. I think it was the narrative concept that just reading a bunch of a recitation of facts and dates, and this is what happened on this date, and this is what happened on that date would be boring to me. Would be, I think one of the comments that I am very gratified by from students is at the end of the course is for them to say how history came alive. That it didn't feel like this was something that happened 80 years ago. It's so many other history classes that they take. It feels. I've heard the word they use is it feels dead. It feels, they're removed from it as a human experience. So I think it was the importance of hearing it from the voices of the people who experienced it at a time in their lives when they were young and still had so much, had to figure out what to do with their lives afterwards. It does have a very Nisei, second generation orientation, and I tried to. There's much more material about them from the Nisei, but there was a little bit out there on the Issei, whether it was because they were English speaking, or in the case of a project that my father was very involved with, to interview Issei pioneers in Orange County, where they were interviewed in Japanese, and then the work was what was published both in Japanese and then translated into English. But that's pretty limited. Brian Ian, the Densho folks, we looked at as many of the Issei related materials as I could find, I could get access to, and just try to include some representation of Issei voice, but for the most part, it's an Issei story.
Definitely, but I think, like I said, that's such an amazing part of the story, and bringing those names and sort of in ways, faces, and tones, and just the different ways people talked about their experiences. I think that gives it so much breadth and life that a lot of other stories don't always get to have.
And I'd like to put in a plug for any of you who are in the audience and have family members yourself who were in the War Relocation Authority jurisdiction, if you ever have the opportunity to go to Washington, D.C., it is possible at the National Archives on Constitution Avenue to access the files for your family members. I was clued into how to do this by Kirsten Hirayashi at the museum and Naomi Hirahara and others. And I had an occasion 3 years ago to be in Washington, D.C. for a conference, and planned a couple of vacation days to be able to go there and pull as many of the files of my parents, my grandparents, and my dad's siblings, and a few of the husbands of my aunts. That was about all I had time for. And it was really one of the most remarkable experiences of my life, to see what kinds of documents they kept on them. It was really mind-blowing. There were psychological assessments done by their school teachers, their medical records, the charts that in pencil that were logging in the hours that they worked, whatever role that they had in camp. Sorry, helicopters going over me. How they kept, it was just amazing what they kept. They kept their school essays about, it was all part of that Americanization program. They kept their essays on what does it mean to you to be an American? And one of my, I told this story in the member meet and greet. One of my uncles was a no-no boy. I had no idea. Are they same or similar archives? That I don't know. So the ones that are in the National Archives on Constitution Avenue were the files that were assembled in order to validate those that were applying for their redress payments. And so otherwise they would have been in, I think, Department of Interior collections out of College Park, but because they were related to the commission hearings and the aftermath of the validation of who was actually in the WRA jurisdiction, then those files, as I understand it, those files were transferred, and it's record 220 at the National Archives.
So I think this will be the final question before we open up for the audience Q&A, and this might be somewhat loaded. But we talk about in the history books about how no one really stood up for Japanese Americans during the incarceration leading up to it. And then later on during the redress era, we have this groundswell of support, not only from the broader AAPI community, but from the American Jewish community, and especially from the African American community. And then in the aftermath of the redress passing, we see the beginning of HR 40 and the idea of creating a commission, much like that which was created for the Japanese American community, but a commission to study reparations for African American slavery. But we're 40 years since that time now, and it's still something that's being talked about and something that is going on. And I think, at least in the work I've done with JCL, there is sort of this idea that Japanese Americans do have a very close tie, of course, to the African American community and the idea of reparations for slavery. And so I wanted to ask all of you, sort of what do you think Japanese Americans can do, or what should Japanese Americans do to support HR 40 and support the idea of redress for the African American community?
So I want to say first that the case for reparations for Black American descendants of U.S. slavery is not based solely on slavery, but also on the nearly 100 years of apartheid, American style, what we widely refer to as Jim Crow, and also the events that happened after the Voting Rights Acts of the 1960s. Sandy mentioned earlier, mass incarceration, anti-Black violence, especially at the hands of police, but discrimination in, credit markets and housing and education and health. These are, all together, what for us make the case for reparations for Black Americans since U.S. slavery. But, yes, there certainly have been significant moments when the two groups were looking to each other, for counsel, but also for tactics The JACL was modeled after the NAACP. HR 40, which we don't support. We don't think the HR 40, now HB 40, is going to get us to true reparations. There's some real substantive problems with the bill that we could talk about if we had time. It too was based upon the study commission description of Japanese American redress movement. We talk a lot in our household about the differences and what made, why this leap hasn't happened. I mean, some of it is social media. Some of it is just sheer numbers of people who were involved. 120,000 is not a small number, but it's not 40 million.
Right.
And
Japanese Americans were never enslaved in the United States.
And there's also the serendipity of Norman Mineta's relationship with Alan Simpson. I don't think that there's anything quite comparable in terms of people who were considering reparations for Black American descendants of U.S. slavery. So,
and you also had
there were different
times and conditions. I was really struck by the testimony that I believe was attributed to Representative Inouye, who remarked that in, I think, 1980, over one weekend, some, I presume, white anti-Vietnam protesters were wrongfully incarcerated for 2.5 days, and they received.
Yeah, that was that statement I was talking about.
Yeah. And then more recently, the Iran hostages, 1986, were given $10,000 per day of their incarceration, which comes to about $4.4 million per person. It was interesting hearing Don Tamaki yesterday. He is one of the members of the California Reparations Task Force, saying that that the dollar amount was kind of pulled out of the air. That's not quite a quote. He was a little more informal.
For the Japanese.
Yeah, there's stories there.
Yes, and we've have talked at length with John Tateshi about that whole process. But what we are focusing on is the elimination of the racial wealth gap,
right,
for Black American descendants of U.S. slavery. So that's another difference.
Yeah, I think that there has been a long tendency to say something to the effect, well, the money really didn't matter. What the people wanted was the apology. And even though the sum of money is far below what we think any reasonable estimate should be, it was not entirely trivial. So in the book, I think, Susan, you say that there's an estimate of about $3 billion in lost property. And so I would estimate that across 120,000 individuals, that would come to about $90,000 per person in 1988. But what people actually received was about $20,000. And that's a considerably smaller amount. It's very different from the amount that was paid to the Iran hostages. But if you think about the fact that the sum goes to every member of a family of 4, then it would amount to $80,000 per household. And if I tried to create a present value estimate, then it would be in the vicinity today, I think, of about $300,000. So it's not irrelevant and it's not trivial. It's not adequate, but I think it would make a difference in people's lives in terms of having that type of resource. So we think it's a very important signal from the Japanese American reparations experience that we have to be very clear and careful about the determination of the amount of restitution.
Yeah, and even that 3 billion figure was, something that I think a lot of, at different points, there were folks that were trying to validate what would be the right kind of process for determining an amount, and so there's reasonable minds that could have differed about what the process would be to come up with whatever the number should have been. But I think one of the things that really struck me, it's one of the quotes that I thought it was important to include was just as the exclusion orders were being posted and the reality of having to, that the government was really going to make them leave their homes and their livelihoods, was the quote by Sue Kunitomi Embry, who said, we realized that we had no voice. We realized that we were powerless. And so whatever the strategies or whatever the applicability of tactics, or even whether there is or would be possible to have any kind of community consensus on an approach. I think for those of us in the Japanese American community to realize this legacy, that there were a few friends, and there were a few of those that tried to say that this was wrong, but we had too few friends, and it wasn't in a place of political cohesion where there was a concept of allyship, where there was the ability to have allies for the Japanese Americans in World War II. And I think what I hear, what I see from, at various, rallies or community demonstrations is for those of us that are descendants of the incarcerees, this commitment or this motivation that, well, my family didn't have anyone that was able to speak out in a coordinated, powerful enough way to have made a difference. And so this concept of, so where I end the book is this concept of how valuable and important allyship is. Whether we have, whether we think that the tactic is going to be the winning one or not, or whether, honestly, I think for those of us that were involved in redress at the time, I think I and others felt like, well, this is the right thing to do. It's the right time to do it. Did I ever really think it would come to pass and there would be the day that President Reagan would be signing that bill? That was part of the magic and the disbelief of that day, that, we couldn't actually believe that it was happening. But the commitment to redress, at least for myself, I should say, that the commitment to redress was that we have to try. It was a moment in time, and we have to do what we can do. And so I think if to answer Matthew's question, what can we in the Japanese American community do? I think it's what my friends in NCRR said with the release of the DVDs, the commission hearings, it was to speak up for justice. It's stand for these stories that we have in common, to make them part of the public consciousness.
Definitely agree. I think standing up and making our voices heard is one of the most important things that we can do today. And so with that, we're coming up on 3 o'clock, which means I believe we're going to open up for Q&A. I don't see anything quite yet, but for everyone listening in, if you want to go ahead and drop your questions in the chat or in the Q&A function, please feel free to. But I do have one more question while we are waiting. So for all of you, I guess the sort of final question you have for me, what do you all hope people get out of this book? What do you hope readers get out of it? Whether that's Japanese Americans or just anyone hoping to learn more about the incarceration or using it for their classroom or for study, or just to learn more about what happened to our community during World War II.
That's right. So I grew up in Texas, and there was one Asian family in my grandparents' community whose surname, I'm embarrassed to say, we butchered. I didn't really understand exactly how their name was spelled and pronounced until I was an adult. And there was absolutely nothing taught in our schools about this whole, incarceration, what happened during World War II. That was just not part of our understanding. And so I'm just hoping that, this book and others are adopted in, schools all the way up, and that the curriculum is, dramatically changed and made fuller, to include, this information, and that it be mandatory, that everyone should have to learn and understand. So we're aware that there was a somewhat robust budget for an education effort in the redress plan, but it was gutted. I think Bill Clinton reduced it by 90%. And I'm here to tell you that had a big effect on Texas. I mean, we did not, get any information. I think, this whole conversation about, not whittling people's experience down to one or two stories, I think is really, really important. And the more we are presented with books like, When Can We Go Back to America, that give us this panoply of voices, and we'll start to demand that. We'll say, well, so what, if this story has, 120,000, people who could inform us, then what can we learn about these other people's lives? But I think, I don't know if it's our short attention span, or, I'm not sure what's driving what, if it's that we get these abbreviated stories and that's what we expect, or if it's the other way around. But I think, having an incredible resource like this makes you want to know more about other groups and their experience in the United States.
The Education and Library Division at Simon & Schuster is on the case of getting this on curriculum lists, and putting out a big campaign this fall to have the book included in libraries, and getting it into the hands of those who review curricular materials. And this is going to be a long game. I was advised that this is a process that will start but happen over years. It does take time for books to hit the approved curriculum lists, whether it's within local school districts or on the state level or whatever, getting it into libraries. So that's very much the plan. And it's I get emails telling me, what they're about to release, and what they're presenting at various panels and conferences and so forth. So so it'll take a while, but that is a goal of the book.
I just want to add, I really want Black American readers to have just a little sense of what it meant for these incarcerees to be separated from their families. I think that's something that will really touch people's hearts, and that will feel familiar enough for them to stay engaged. I mean, Sandy will tell you, their entire days, I was just reading the book. I just could not put it down. And, I think, once you see how the book is set up and how you can go back and forth, I love the glossary. I thought, oh, this is really great. We're teaching young people, hopefully, and older folks as well, read with your dictionary. It's important to have, there are things that you don't know. There are things that you could understand better. And here's a guide right here. Here's a glossary. But this idea that you're not supposed to understand it from the beginning.
Yeah.
You don't have the tools to understand it, but we're going to give you some tools. We're going to supply some tools right here within this tome that will help you to appreciate and learn, really, this important story.
Yeah, Matthew, I'd like to push back gently on something that you said earlier. I think that the testimonials in the book are much more than snippets. I think that they're organic to the book.
Yes.
And so I think we need to describe them in a richer way than that. And Susan, I was curious about a subset of the testimonials, which were the poems that you had included. And I was curious about, why you chose to include poetry, and what purpose it served from your perspective in the book.
Well, there were more than one reason. One, as I came across them, they just seemed to be yet another powerful way of how those writers, those incarcerees were expressing emotion. As a teaching tool, it is part of the Common Core to have, so for instance, for a literature or English class, one of the techniques would be to compare poetry with a nonfiction narrative. And so, you know, what do you learn by the expression of the writer's feelings and thoughts as it was expressed in poetry versus just as a different literary modality. And so, you know, being able to compare and contrast narrative structure. And some of it is because, so for instance, Mitsuya Yamada poem on entitled Evacuation, and she says that the photographer, when they're being forcibly removed, and the photographer says smile, and you know, she smiles, you know, because that's your reaction. It's natural when you know you smile, and all these photos that are taken by the government photographers of happy people waving and smiling as the buses are pulling away or as the trains are pulling away, and it's because you know, there's a photographer and they say smile, and you do, and then it says, you know, they're having a good time. They're, you know, they're compliant. You know, they think that you know they're going along with this, and I just thought in those words in her poem, she said exactly all the things that I could have tried to describe in a paragraph, right? Or so. And for instance, the Louise Ogawa, the Tonka, just some really interesting circumstances, right? So this is someone who was that was one of the few Issei voices, someone who wrote in Japanese, and there is one book that translated her Tonka that was written in Japanese into English. And just to honor that kind of artistic accomplishment. And then you think of one, and then you come across another. the poem on loyalty I saw in a camp newspaper. Let's see.
We did have one. Oh, no, go ahead if you want to answer Kathy's question or read out Kathy's question.
Yeah, hi, Kathy. So I think this is probably a question, Kirsten and Sandy, for you. What are other ways that Japanese Americans can support the efforts for reparations for African Americans? Over 300 people did submit testimonies in support of HR 40 with the desire to see further discussion and education on the history and need for reparations. Do you think that had an impact?
So big sigh. So we believe, so HR 40 is difficult because it's the only game in town. And because it is backed by Black politicians, it's really impolitic, many people feel, to say anything negative about it. But the bill is deeply problematic, and we don't support it. And we hope that you won't support it either. So there are 4 major regions that the bill as written we feel is deficient. And Sam can talk a bit about some of the structural problems with the bill. So HR 40 does not identify the eligible recipients of reparations. And that's one of the things that we have certainly learned from the Japanese redress movement, that specificity is really important. So for us, those are individuals who can meet both a lineage and an identity standard. So these are people who are descended from at least one person who was enslaved in the United States and who self-identify as Black, African American, Negro, or Afro-American, and have done so at least 12 years prior to the onset of a reparations program or the creation of a reparations study commission. HR 40 does not identify the elimination of the racial wealth gap as one of its primary goals, which we think is really deeply problematic. I mean, as Sandy said earlier, it's about $890,000 per household at the mean. You know, it would take at least $11 trillion on the low end to erase that debt.
Yeah.
And HR 40 does not specify that reparations should be made in the form of direct payments to the eligible recipients. And then fourthly, it does not specify that the federal government is the culpable party and should pay reparations. So those are four major problems, you know, four major deficits with HR 40.
Yeah, it leaves everything open.
Everything's open. There's no real directive.
That's a real problem with a commission that's charged with bringing proposals to Congress for reparations for Black American descendants of U.S. slavery. You know, we could have a situation where the commission comes forward and says, well, just issue another apology. And in this case, if the target is to eliminate racial wealth differences because they are the cumulative product across generations of American racism, then the bill for the commission should direct the commission to take on that as a central aspect of the proposal that they bring forward to Congress. But there are also some structural issues with the bill. And I think I would like to highlight a couple. The first is that the bill indicates that the Federal Advisory Committee Act is not applicable to the commission. And the Federal Advisory Committee Act is the Transparency Act. It's the act that says that the commission must make its deliberations and proceedings public. It should hold hearings and the like, precisely as the Commission on Wartime Relocation and Internment of Civilians did. But the HR 40 Commission would not be obligated to do that under the terms of the law as it's currently written. The other thing I'd like to mention is that the law as currently written provides for salaries for the commission members of up to $172,000. And the commission now is specified to have 15 members. Originally it was 7. And that's odd too, because the quorum is set as 7.
Not a majority.
Not a majority of 15, right? But the idea of salaries for members of a commission that has this type of a sacred mission strikes us as highly unethical, and so, you know, we have strong reservations about this piece of legislation, and unfortunately, because people were not really thinking that there might be some problems with the legislation itself, folks who are pretty fervent advocates of reparations have signed on to the bill. But you know, we would ask advocates of Black reparations to not support HR 40, at least as it's presently written, and insist on a very different piece of legislation that might be the prelude to the formation of a commission that would design proposals for reparations for Black American descendants of U.S. slavery.
Thank you both so much for all that clarification. I think for a lot of us, it is a topic that we're somewhat familiar with, but of course don't know as much about as we'd like to. So thank you both for that background. And I have another question here who's actually came in from the prior session, the closed session we have with JANA members and JSL members. And this is for you, Susan. It was a question on the narrative, first-person narratives and choices to not have photographs in the book. Is it essential to understand the background and why photographers were hired as contractors to take photos of the camps by the WRA and by the government versus those who were not?
Yeah, no, that's a very good point. Well, there's a number of reasons why it was very much a decision not to include any images or photos. One was exactly for that reason, that it was pretty hard to come up with photos that were not that government perspective of very well decorated, excuse me, very well decorated living quarters inside the barracks, incarcerees dressed in their finest clothes, happy people waving, playing, the boys playing baseball, girls singing in choirs, so it was pretty hard to come up with, more the Toyo Miyatake, Dorothea Lange approach that was, more unvarnished. And the other, so there was a question of how do you choose, and there was also the motivation to keep it away from being what I was hearing being called a picture book, that for children, junior high, what I'll call the encyclopedia approach, where there was big pictures, the USS Arizona on its side, we were trying not to be that, right, where there were big pictures and little text. And so from the very beginning, there was a decision not to include photos. The other is the quality. So much of what is available are not originals, and they're reproductions of reproductions of reproductions, and so things start to get pretty grainy. The cover photo, folks might recognize, is a Dorothea Lange photo of the Mochida family, and it's a close-up of the children, and again it was that search of what were photos that showed something of the gravity of the situation, and not the happy times or yearbook kind of photo. And what the folks that were involved in the cover design were gravitating to for this close-up was they thought it was important to show the ID tag, and that these are children's faces, and they've got that ID tag.
Yeah, I think the cover is a very, very powerful photo, and I think it's one that was an extremely good choice to use. I mean, as you said, there are so many photos of the incarceration, and it's hard to choose any just one. But I think we are coming up on time. We don't have any further questions, but I did want to read actually one comment that we got in the chat really quick from Mineta Toshiro, who said, "During and at present, I enrolled myself in COVID University, and Amazon profited from all the books I purchased. When Can We Go Back to America has become my thesaurus on the compilation of excerpts from the book I read and more. Thank you for helping me organize the thoughts and history, as well as how I can share these conversations with my grandchildren."
Thank you, Anna. That's really great. Thank you.
And even David also commented that it was a wonderful testimonial for the book, and I would agree. It was an amazing and wonderful summary and wrap up of the book. But before we hand it back over to Joy, just some last minute things. I wanted to say thank you all for attending today. Thank you all for joining us today. And it was great to be in conversation with all of you here today. I will pass it over to you all if you have any last minute things you want to tell the audience, where they can find your work, follow you on social media, or any upcoming projects you all have.
Okay, I'll pitch in on this one. Yes, I am obsessively on Twitter, which is a problem, but you can find me at Sandy Darity, and Kirsten and I would be thrilled if people are interested in reading our book, From Here to Equality: Reparations for Black Americans in the 21st Century, which is available at COVID University also.
It's a wonderful book. I highly recommend it. And I am trying to be better at social media. I rely on peeps that are naturals at it. You can find information about the course, the upcoming events, the press on my website, and the links to the social media accounts on my website, susanhkamei.com. I'll tell a story on my 93-year-old mother. And so when I was trying to explain to her what social media is all about, and that I was launching a website and that sort of thing. And so she said, oh, okay, so write it down for me how I find your website. And I said, well, it's susanhkamei.com. And she goes, let me write this down. I go, Mom, it's my name. She said, no, write it down for me. I wrote it.
Yeah.
Well, we so appreciate this opportunity to be in conversation with you, to collaborate with you, and
We're not done, Kirsten and
Okay.
Sandy. We have,
Okay.
we have a lot more work to do together.
well, we're
Wonderful.
excited, and I want you to know this is going to be my holiday gift of choice.
Oh, thank you.
I've already made my bulk order. Yes, so very excited.
Great. Thank you.
Thank
so
you.
much.
I see so many wonderful friend names in the chat, and I wish I could see you all.
Great. Thank you all so much. I will give one final plug. If you want to learn more about JACL, of course, you can always visit us at jacl.org. But with that, I'll pass it over to Joy to give our closing from JANM.
Hi, thank you so much to all. I hope that everyone at home joins me in a huge round of applause. I know we can't hear you, but we can feel that. So thank you so much to all of you, Susan, Kirsten, Sandy, and Matt. Thank you so much. It's been such a enlightening and exciting conversation, and we're just really grateful to be able to host you all here virtually, and hope to see you at the museum soon. As I kept mentioning in the chat, you can purchase this wonderful book, and we have limited number of signed copies available. So please check that out from the JANM store. We love to support COVID University. So please check that out. Please check out our upcoming programs, and follow all of these wonderful people and their work as we move forward. So a special thank you again to all of you, and please stay in touch and have a great, oh, Kirsten, did you? Oh, you're muted, sorry. I don't know.
Sandy reminded me earlier that in 1994, my sister, Harriet, and I took our maternal grandmother to the museum. And it took us a little, my sister just moved to Los Angeles, and it took us a while to find it. We were just so thrilled, we weren't lost anymore. We found, the Japanese American National Museum. And what was amazing, my grandmother was really, trying to kind of grapple with, what was being exhibited, what was on display. But when the staff saw her, and she was probably in her
mid to late 80s by then.
And they ran up to us and introduced themselves and brought a chair for her. And they literally sat at her feet and brought books to her to explain the exhibits. It was just such a, I don't know. I mean, I think I wept at the time. It was just, they were so
They honored the elder.
They honored the elder. It was just, it was such a wonderful moment. And she, we all learned a tremendous amount, but I was just so glad that we had made the trek, and just that, just the reception that I didn't know what to expect, really. I mean, we're just going to be, just tourists in the museum, but they made it an incredibly special and memorable experience for the three of us, and I'm really grateful.
That means so much to us, and I'm so grateful that we were able to welcome your mother and just welcome everyone into the space to learn these histories. And Susan's book is such a wonderful way to reach even more folks, even beyond the galleries. So really grateful to all of you, and thank you for sharing that story. And
Please come back to LA soon.
yes, please come back to LA, and we'd love to have you all back. Well, thank you, everyone. Have a great afternoon where you are, and stay in touch, and we'll see you next time. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.